Today's dos uno. Welcome everybody to episode 15 of Ty's Training Talking with My Dad. This is the week of March 31st. I'm Ty, and I am actually not here with my wonderful father and co-host Tim Andrews. I am currently in Nepal for Project Himalaya, and unfortunately we are having connectivity issues. So the way this is going to work is he's recorded the questions, I'm going to record the answers, and we're going to see if our amazing team can piecemeal that together to put something that you guys can actually enjoy and listen to. Hopefully, fingers crossed. So here we are. We're in Nepal, though. It's awesome. Speaking of Nepal, here we are at 4,900 meters. That's about 16,000 feet for my imperial friends here in the town of Kara, Nepal, which will be my home base for the next let's see, probably about a month. Recording this on April 8th. So probably, almost a month here. Very exciting. Oh, and I guess before I will give you the totals for last week, it was a big travel week. That's a lot of what we talk about in this episode, or what the questions are, is the ridiculous travel from Quito, Ecuador to Kara, Nepal, which are not close together. So 68 kilometers, 18 hours of training time, and 11,400 meters of vert. So that's our intro. Let's get to the questions.
So thanks for the intro and the numbers, Tyler. Let's get to the questions. Before we go back to the beginning of the week, you've now made it to the Himalayas in Nepal after a very long week of travel. In fact, I noticed you kept your stopwatch on the whole time. So how are you feeling? Tell us the total time of the journey and how did the travel week go overall?
So travel week, I'd say, went about as smoothly as it could, given like just how outrageously far away these places are, literally, and in terms of all the various modes of transportation. I actually started my watch timer when I left Quito for my apartment, like going to the airport, and I think it was 95 and a half hours until I got here to this room in Kara, Nepal. So, actually not that bad when you think about it, because I had like an entire day layover in Massachusetts where I was visiting my folks and doing the great reorganization, and then also another day in Kathmandu where also another great reorganization because I had a lot of stuff there. So all in all, I went really, really smoothly. I was very lucky that, flights were on time, bags all made it everywhere. That was, I think, we've talked a lot about this idea of kind of the uncontrollable things, and that was definitely a really big one. Was, okay, can I get all of my stuff to Kare without losing anything, without breaking anything important? Because some of my gear is literally irreplaceable custom stuff, and even if it's not, it would be very, very hard to replace up here. So everything made it. I made it, and overall, it was great. Yeah, I was able to see you guys, see my family, see Connor, see my friend David while I was in Massachusetts. That was really fantastic. And otherwise, pretty smooth travel. I think I'm just become a really good traveler because I've done it so much, and I'm good at sleeping on planes and stuff. And overall, I'd say it went about as smooth as possible.
Last time we recorded, you mentioned some chaos leading up to the workout on Monday with all the trouble you had with the altitude generator in Quito breaking down. How did you end up dealing with that?
Yeah, so it was pretty outrageous, honestly, what ended up happening with the altitude generator. So if you missed this last week, long story short, I had a big hypoxic workout trained for the second to last day I was going to be in Quito, and my altitude generator broke that day, or I guess the day before. And I managed to find probably the only other altitude generator in all of Ecuador, through just the wonderful Ecuador athlete community. This woman named Gisela, who runs a company called Sport Fix. So huge shout out to Gisela and Sport Fix. They totally saved me. And long story short, she hooked me up in like less than 12 hours. I had that unit and was able to take it to the gym where I've been doing, a bigger lifts and training sessions. They have Stairmaster as well as treadmill down there, and hook up the machine. And this time the machine did not frizz out and die, and it went really well. And I think that's the next question is the like actually talking about the workout. So I guess I won't jump the gun there. But overall it was honestly a complete miracle. I was like, I really thought maybe this is the only machine that is in all of Ecuador, and it was a good opportunity to practice just reframing and being like, okay, I can't do this, and that's fine, and I don't need it for my preparation to go 100% perfectly. And then at the same time, it was kind of the best of both worlds, because I think I practiced that idea of letting go, but then everything ended up working out really well in the end.
Let's talk about the big hypoxic workout on Monday, which was a massive simulation of the Everest climb. Can you walk us through how you mapped out the various segments of this workout and altitude changes for the 8 hour long session?
Yeah, so the workout itself, the idea was to simulate from about uh Camp 2, which is about 6,400 meters, about 20,000 feet, to the top of Everest, 29,000 feet. And because we're in Quito and these generators stack with the altitude, you can reach Everest altitude, and actually even higher with in terms of hypoxia that's created. So that's really, really cool. And it's super unique to being in a place like that. So I tried to do it where I was kind of matching the grade. It was honestly almost entirely on the Stairmaster. The only part that was different was like the first, I don't know, 40 minutes out of Camp 2. You have this kind of gentle climb that's pretty, not flat, but it's 10 or 15% grade. So I did that on the treadmill, and then everything else was on the Stairmaster. And in terms of the altitude, obviously I couldn't be like, tweaking it every 5 minutes. So I basically split it up by each big milestone. And I mapped those out on the route. So, you have Camp 2, and then there's a thing called the Bergstrand, which is like the first kind of technical piece above Camp 2. Then you have Camp 3, and then you have Camp 4. And then you have the balcony, which is basically halfway to the summit from Camp 4. And then you have the summit. And so on each of those, I was raising the altitude a little bit. And I was making it so that the segment leading up to that was all done at that altitude. So, for example, the last piece, which we'll talk about, was all done at 9,000 meters. I think it was 4 hours or something was at 9,000 meters. So that was obviously a very hard part, but I think, the idea is to try and make it as both realistic, but also err on the side of making it a little bit harder because we're in a gym that's going to make it a little bit easier. So we want to make sure that we're accommodating for that.
That's amazing. During the last 4 hour stretch at the simulated 9,000 meter altitude, you still maintained over 500 meters plus of vertical gain per hour. How does this compare to anything you've done previously in hypoxic training? And what does this tell you about where your current fitness level is?
Yeah, good question. It it's hard to interpret a little bit because it I haven't really done anything that much like this. Obviously, climbing on a stairmaster in a gym is pretty far away from climbing on a mountain on a glacier in snow in a giant 8,000 meter boot and or suit and all that gear and having wind and cold and all that stuff. So I don't think it's definitely not apples to apples. That said, I think it's I've done a little bit of comparison between, for example, some of the treadmill workouts I've done and my runs on Polichaski. And so I know more or less, okay, for that, the treadmill maybe is like 30 or 40% faster than actually running outside on the Polichaski. So if I take that, and even if I like double it, I'm like, okay, maybe it's doubled speed, that's still 250 meters an hour, which is really, really solid moving up there. If I can do that from, 8,000 meters to the summit, it's going to be a very, very good day. So it's it it's really interesting mostly. I think the thing that I've noticed is just my tolerance for hypoxia has definitely improved. And that's one thing where I see it as, okay, my tolerance for hypoxia from this machine with the mask on, no questions that that's improved. Now, when I go to Nepal, like I am now, will that actually translate to, being up at these really high altitudes? That is the crux. And that is kind of what we're waiting to see. So I think, mostly I think the most important thing from a training perspective was it went really well in terms of just energy, fueling, all those things. 8 hours in a gym sounds pretty miserable. And it actually felt like I managed my effort and time and energy and all that stuff really well. It never felt super, super long, which is a weird thing to say when you're talking about doing like 7.5 hours on the Stairmaster. I think the fact that I had, my food timer and I was thinking about that and I had all these like kind of check-in points of, okay, I'm going to be at this, you know, camp or whatever. I think that really helped break it up a lot. So I think mentally and physically it went super, super well. In terms of how it would compare to anything else. It's just I'd never done anything like it. So I just don't know. I know that I was able to tolerate 4 hours of hypoxia at 6.5% and not feel that terrible. So that's pretty remarkable. But again, I don't really have anything to compare it against. So that's where now there's the exciting part is seeing, okay, how does it stack up when I'm actually out here in the big mountains?
Monday's workout wrapped up your final training block in Quito with some impressive numbers, averaging 134 kilometers per week, 17,532 meters plus of vertical gain per week, which, by the way, is approximately 2 Mount Everests, and over 38 hours of training weekly. How do these metrics compare to your preparation for previous high altitude attempts?
I want to go back to the idea of you don't have to be fitter than you were for Manaslu, because I just want to keep reminding myself of that. Make sure like you, Mr. C, and the audience are holding me accountable to that. So objectively, like every single metric is better than my previous buildups. Looking at my last buildup towards Manaslu, which is the obvious point of comparison, um, I am healthier. I had more volume. I had more vert. I had better workouts. I had faster workouts. I had more consistent training. I had better recovery. I had less stress in my life. Like every single metric is better. So, obviously the numbers are great. The big vert numbers, the big hours, whatever that is, that's awesome. But to me, it's mostly just about the consistency and health. That is the most important thing. Even last summer, which was a really good buildup, and obviously Manaslu went really well. I still had a little glute injury in the middle of the summer that kind of, kept me off of the mountains for, I don't know, a week or two. There was like a whole week where I was on the bike. So, you know, objectively, everything just went smoother this time. And I feel so much stronger and more confident. And that gives me this ability to remember, okay, you don't have to be fitter than Manaslu. You are fitter than the prep for Manaslu, and you can take that and use it as we talk about memory bank, right? Where when things get hard, you can kind of go to your memory bank of looking for positive things. And this is a huge part of that is when things don't go perfectly. For example, if my altitude tent breaks and I can't do that huge workout that I thought was really important, okay, it's not that big a deal because I'm so much fitter. I'm so much farther ahead of where I need to be. So I think that's really the big takeaway for me is it feels like I am further ahead than I necessarily need to be. And that gives me this ability to just roll with it a little bit more, listen to my body a little bit more, and absorb whatever life here in the Himalayas is going to throw at me over these next like 4 or 5 weeks.
The transition from Ecuador to Nepal involves several flights and significant time zone changes. What's your strategy when traveling so much for managing traveling fatigue while maintaining fitness during these transition periods?
I remember we talked about this a little bit when I had the trip to Switzerland back in February as kind of like a practice run for this trip. And I think it was really helpful because the biggest thing was expectations versus reality. So I went into this whole week, I did the really big workout on Monday. That was the big hypoxic gym workout. And then after that, I was like, I have no idea what I'm going to do this week. It's like kind of a recovery week. It's all like in terms of just the volume and all that stuff, I'm not worried about. It'll also be a little bit stressful on the body just with all the travel and time zone changes and all that. But I think the biggest thing was just, whatever training I get in, I get in. If I can get in an hour a day, fantastic. Like that's what I'm looking for this week. And I think that set me up really well for just not having that stress of, oh, I really need to get in 3 hours on the treadmill or whatever it was that I was trying to do in Switzerland and just beating myself up for no reason. So that's the number one thing. And then practically, I guess, for our listeners, I think I have become a pretty good traveler, especially east-west travel, I think is really different than north-south travel. I've done an enormous amount of north-south travel, like, USA to Latin America. I've done so much of that, and it is so much easier than USA to Asia, or in this case, Latin America to Asia, where you have, a 10 or 12 hour time zone change as well. That is harder. Honestly, like this is where I just like have totally turned over to pharmacology and I will take I'll take a like whole cocktail of like melatonin and NyQuil to just pass out on airplanes. Like I had an overnight flight from Boston to Doha. It was like 12 hours and had a long tiring day in Massachusetts. It was great, but I was tired. I took like a couple of NyQuil and some melatonin and I was out like the entire flight and that was great. And then, having a bunch of caffeine as soon as I get in. Mostly I've found that like I think I used to focus on this idea that like, oh, you have to sleep at the right time for like where you're going and then be awake and blah blah blah. And so you're like maximizing your sleep time and then but also you want to wake up so you're like on the day schedule. And honestly, for me, it's just like just lie down and sleep as much as possible. Like that is my number one piece of advice. I have completely forgotten about any of like trying to get onto the country's time zone until I literally walk, through customs into that country. When I have a bunch of flights in a row and I'm going through airports or whatever, I just try to sleep as much as I can. And that worked really well on this trip, even if it's, I'm sleeping during the day in Kathmandu. Yeah, I am, but I'm also sleeping. And like, that's just going to set me up better. So I would say sleep as much as you can, hydrate as much as you can. And if you can get a little bit of exercise, just like walking around the airport, even, that's great.
You mentioned meeting with Mark Batard and Kaji Sherpa, the current Everest record holders. That must have been very exciting for you. What insights did you gain from that conversation that might influence your approach?
This was actually a really cool surprise. So Dawa Steven Sherpa, who is a good friend of mine, and Asian Trekking right here, that's his company, and they handle all the logistics for all of my expeditions here in the Himalaya. He's the man. He knows everybody, and his family knows everybody. His dad literally pioneered like Himalayan climbing back in the 80s. He was the first people. He was, excuse me, the first person that was taking people on the north side of Everest in Tibet, for example, as well as a lot of the 8,000ers here in Nepal. So they go way back. They know everyone. And at some point, he's been very involved in Project Himalaya from the beginning. And he was like, hey, Kaji Sherpa like comes to my restaurant, my family's restaurant, like all the time. Why don't we arrange a meeting with you and him? And you can pick his brain a little bit, and it'll be kind of an intergenerational thing. It's really cool. And by the way, then later it happened that Mark Batard, who also had the record, is also in town. So we managed to make this happen where all three of us met for coffee at Dawa's place called the Aztrek Compound, which is like it's like a really cool little hip spot in Kathmandu. It's like a climbing wall, bouldering wall, and also a little hip restaurant and like craft brewery. And they also have the local Nepali like climbing gear shop called Everest Outfit is in there. So it's a very very cool space. And anyways, we met up with the three of us, and it was a very cool thing because I mean, Mark Batard is in his 70s. He set his record of 22 and a half hours in 1988, which is before I was born, and and then Kaji set his 10 years later in 1988 when I was 7 years old, 8 years old, and now here we all are together. It was mostly just a very very cool opportunity to get to like talk to these guys and hear their stories. One of the things in terms of things that I learned or takeaways. Um, both of them said that they had been to 8,000 like multiple times before going to the summit. So I think Mark said he had climbed Choyu, which is a 8,000er in on the border of Tibet and Nepal. It's like 8.2, and had gone up and made like he made like three different attempts before he actually went to the summit, which is crazy. Like he told me he went like all the way to 8,000, and then he went like all the way to the balcony, which is like 8,800 meters, and like turned around, came back down, and then just a few days later went back up. So I think that actually is a really big takeaway to me of, okay, if you're super fit and you're well acclimated, it's never too late to have a second opportunity. I think that's a really important thing to remember. And that's why I want to go early for that exact reason. And giving yourself that option of, okay, if we're going on one of the first days of the season, we have all season to be able to go up, go up again. And the fact that Mark said, I think he literally only rested like 2 days or something and then went back up and did it is pretty remarkable. So it definitely opens some possibilities for kind of, if things don't go perfectly, there's backup options, which is super cool. But mostly it was honestly, it was really, really cool to get to meet these guys and hear some of their stories from, 30, 40 years in the Himalaya. It's incredible.
Your first day in Kare included a climb to 6,000 meters on Mira Peak. What were your observations about your body's initial adaptation to being back at high altitude? In other words, how'd it go?
It's funny. I looked at my log from before Manaslu, so last fall, and I had kind of forgotten, but I spent like a week in Chamonix, France, right before I came to Nepal, which is basically sea level. And so at first I was like, oh, am I gonna lose? Am I gonna lose some acclimatization? This is like a 5 or 6 day journey, and I'm gonna be in Kathmandu, and I'm gonna be in Massachusetts, and blah blah blah. it didn't matter. It was totally fine. Like, yeah, I went to 6,000 meters on my first day here. I could have gone to the summit. I was just being conservative, and like I was honestly just kind of tired. Mostly my body just felt a little bit tired, which is 100% to be expected. Like I've said multiple times now, I gave myself this entire week and like first few days of being here to just feel like complete garbage, and anything above that is fantastic. So yeah, the fact that I got up to 6,000 on day one felt totally fine. Legs were a little bit tired, pretty much makes sense. I don't think there was anything like to worry about, or anything like it just felt fine. It didn't really feel that different than going up Ruku, honestly. So, if anything, I'd say that probably hints that the acclimatization stuff is real, and I'll get a lot more data over the coming, week or, couple of weeks here as we start to get higher and higher and go up into some bigger mountains. So yeah, so far so good, I would say is the very short recap.
As a super nerd, you successfully set up what you called, almost certainly for the first time ever, a functioning altitude masks setup at almost 5,000 meters in the Himalaya. How crucial do you think this innovation is to your preparation in these final weeks?
The short answer is we don't really know, and we won't know. I mean, even if it goes really well on the record day, we still won't really know how important it was. I think it's really important. I think that we're doing something unique and that hasn't been done before. And just based on the experience over the last 3 months in keto of playing around with those hypoxic, the hypoxic mask setup and pushing the altitude up higher and higher and higher, culminating in that really big workout last Monday, I really do think that there's something to it. And now, having been here, and spoiler alert, I'm a couple days past that for 6,000. I went to the summit today, which is 6.5, I think, and again felt completely fine. No altitude problems at all. So I think all of that is a really, really good sign that things are working. And the fact that we see the changes, from 7,000 to 7.5 to 8,000 to 9,000 meters, of altitude on the bike while we're doing it and seeing those adaptations happen, I think that's the part that's really interesting, because if we can continue that for the next month, and I can feel even relatively comfortable at 8,000, 8,500, 9,000 meters, which is, that last big chunk of Everest, that will make a huge, huge difference. We really still need to see the data of getting up higher, which we will do in the next couple of weeks. I'll go up to Barunse, which is 7.2. So that'll definitely give us some information. And then, we really won't have full concrete information until we get up to 8,000 and over, which I, probably only going to do one time before going to the summit. So I think it's definitely, it's a box that I felt like I could check. Logistically, it was very, very complicated to settle this up here. But I'm convinced, honestly. I think it's really important. And I think it's going to be maybe kind of the magic bullet that helps us really smash the record when it comes to that in May.
Now that you're on site in the Himalayas with about 1 month to go until the record attempt, what are your top priorities for this training block? How will it look different from the last block that you did in Quito?
I was thinking about this today, and it's interesting because I actually think that my vert and mileage will all go down pretty significantly. If you remember, I talked about kind of like we're cheating on vert in Quito because we have two things. One is we have the treadmill and Stairmaster, which is all uphill, and the other is we have the teleferico, which means I can come down and cut off about 800 meters of descent whenever I go up on Ruku, which is great. Saves my legs some of the pounding. I don't have that here, right? There's no way to, I can't cheat vert. Every meter that I go up, I have to come back down. And so I think that will actually change the kind of profile of what my training looks like from a numbers perspective. I think the vert will be much, much lower. We're also way higher, right? I mean, my bedroom here is 4,900 meters, which is, what is that, 200 meters above the summit of Ruku. So we're starting at a much higher place and going much higher, and it just slows everything down proportionally. So I think that the vert will be lower. I think the mileage, like the kilometers, will be lower. My goal is that the hours stays about the same, and that I'm still able to get in that higher end work, at least twice a week of doing some kind of high intensity interval training, ideally a double session, maybe that afternoon session is on the bike here, because again, I don't have the gym, I don't have a treadmill to go do it on, and sometimes afternoons get stormy. So I think in general, I'm trying to make it as much like the last block in keto as possible, while also recognizing that we are not in a city of 2 million people. We are in a town of like a dozen buildings at 4,900 meters with like very limited infrastructure and electricity and all these things. And like, yeah, even the fact that I have a stationary bike and the altitude tent up here is like totally, totally outrageous. So the fact, like, just again, expectations versus reality, like as close as I can get to that, what I had in keto, the better, but also recognizing it's going to be different and that's okay. Like there's also different new stuff that's exciting that's here. It's good. Being on snow every day, working with gear, working with, my crampons and microspikes and just getting used to being on steeper, more exposed terrain every day. That's all super, super valuable. So it's not like it's all a problem to be dealt with. There's definitely huge pluses to being here. It's also just totally beautiful. Like this valley is one of the most outrageously beautiful places in the whole world. So that's pretty awesome. And yeah, mostly it's just yeah, time on feet, being out there for a long time, putting in a lot of work for another 3 weeks, and then we kind of start tapering it back.
You spent significant time in the Himalaya over the years. What first brought you to this region? And tell us about your very first trip here.
All right, my very first trip to the Himalaya. So this was late February of 2020. I had just run the Olympic marathon trials on February 29th. It was leap day, I remember. And it was actually a really like bad, dark time of my life. My ex and I, who had been together for, most of my 20s, we had just split up that January. And the Olympic trials, it was fine. It didn't go great. And I just wanted to go do something for myself that was exciting. And I literally got a ticket with airline miles like the day before or something. I was like in Atlanta for the trials and got this ticket and like flew back to Massachusetts and then flew to Nepal like the next day. So it was totally on a whim. I had no idea what I was doing. Here's the other thing. I wasn't even planning to come here. I was actually planning to go to Spain and do a climbing trip with a friend, Javi from Spain, who had kind of been a mentor to me on like more technical climbing. And he had sent me a message like a few days before the trials being like, hey, the conditions are really bad in the mountains. The weather's really bad. I think we should cancel this trip. And I was like, oh, okay. Now I guess I'm like, for the first time in like a decade, I am single and I have this kind of like post-season time where I generally do something fun and I can literally go anywhere in the world. This is pretty cool. So I was like, okay, what can I do? And I found that cheap mileage ticket to Nepal and I booked it and I was like, okay, let's go. And I came here without much of a plan. I knew I wanted to come up to the Khumbu Valley, which is the Everest region, and just kind of do some hiking and trail running and stuff like that. And this, for our younger listeners who might not even remember this, late February, early March of 2020 is when the COVID-19 pandemic started to really blow up. It was already spreading to Europe at that point. And I distinctly remember going up into the Khumbu and going off grid for a couple of days and coming back and it was like the entire world had changed. All of a sudden it was like, like March Madness had been canceled and things like that. And I was like, wait, what is going on? Like this is nuts. Like the whole world was like imploding. And what came with that was that a whole bunch of races for running stuff was canceled for the spring very quickly. And that led me to actually try and do my first like really big long FKT there, which was the Everest Base Camp Trail. It was like 110 kilometers. Because originally I had something planned. I can't even remember what it was, but something planned when I got back, some kind of race, and was like, well, I'm not doing that, so I might as well do something cool while I'm here. And so that was a really wild, wonderful experience. Was doing this thing. It was the longest thing I'd ever done, by mileage, by time. It was like almost 24 hours. A lot of altitude, vert, all that good stuff. It's super, just like full on adventure, and that I kind of caught the bug. I just loved it so much here. It was so beautiful. Nepal had always kind of been on my bucket list in the Himalaya, and it felt so far and remote and committing in terms of like, I felt like you really had to come here for a long time. And there is some truth to that because it's so far away. But yeah, it was the weirdest introduction to being in Nepal, honestly, because yeah, the whole world just completely turned upside down during the like, I don't know, week or two that I was here. It was really wild.
And how did you go from some trail running and easy hiking to setting speed records on 8,000-meter peaks and finally now to attempting the record on Mount Everest?
I think there was a gradual progression. So that first trip was in 2020, and then I don't think I went back until maybe 2022 or so. And at that point, I came here and actually wanted to do some climbing, some easier like 6,000 meter peaks, and still doing some trail running and all that stuff. But I'd always kind of dabbled in mountaineering, and at that point, I'd set the records on Cotopaxi and stuff like that, and I was like, okay, I enjoy this. This is really cool, and let's go try and do some of this in Nepal and some of these smaller mountains. Like honestly, the biggest barrier to the 8,000ers at the beginning was just financial. They're really expensive, and I was a broke, struggling athlete. It's not a super glamorous lifestyle, and those expeditions are really expensive. Even an Everest permit is $15,000. Whereas like, you know, when I go to Aconcagua in the Andes, it's like, I don't know, $400 is the permit or something, so it's like all of my mountaineering expeditions that I had done up to that point, like would not have been as expensive as one Everest permit, which is kind of crazy to think about. But yeah, I think it was just, it was like a natural transition to me. It wasn't just happening in Nepal. It was happening in my running career in general. So I was going from doing trail running stuff to doing more big mountain stuff like Cotopaxi, like Ojos and Aconcagua and Kilimanjaro and these other mountains, which, some of those are, Cotopaxi's glaciated. Some of those are more just kind of like hiking peaks. And I wanted to get more skills on bigger mountains, more complicated mountains. And so it was just a matter of figuring out literally like, okay, what can I afford to climb in Nepal? Because it's really expensive to climb in the Himalaya. And so I started with, the kind of bootstrapping, cheaper, smaller mountains and just like gradually moved up. And it wasn't until we started talking about doing an Everest project, really, that was the thing, that made me sign up for my first expedition to an 8,000er, which was Manaslu in 2023, with Asian Trekking with Taoist Stephen Sherpa, because we were already talking about Everest at that point. And I was like, okay, well, I'm not going to have Everest be my first 8,000er when I'm, doing it in a style where I'm going for a speed record and with all this spotlight and whatever. So I better get over there and learn. And I did. So, that honestly, when I booked that first trip, it was before I had signed anything, before I had, some of the contracts that I do now. And I paid for that on my savings. Like that was it. I just like wrote a check, and it was like, I totally could not afford it, at the time. And in retrospect, it was a great decision. It worked out, but at the time it was really stressful. Honestly, it was a really hard thing to deal with, and it caused a lot of strain in my relationship at the time. I remember, but I was like, hey, I think this Everest thing is going to happen, and I need to invest in myself, essentially, even though at that point it still wasn't official. Nothing had been signed. It hadn't been greenlit. And so it was a really big deal up for me at the time. But yeah, and obviously hindsight's 2020, but I'm super glad I did it. And, I guess regardless, like I found a huge passion and love for the big mountains, and I'm glad I gave myself that opportunity.
How has your experience in the Himalayas shaped your approach to mountain athletics and your perspective on high altitude performance more broadly?
I think that there's a lot less known about Himalayan climbing from a physiological perspective than there is about, say, marathoning, which I find fascinating because I'm a very curious person. I'm a student of the sport of track and field, of ultra running, of trail running, and of mountaineering and mountain running as well. I think that's one of the things that I found when I first got here was, even that very first trip in 2020, I remember talking to some guy who I like met at the airport, who's just, one of those guys standing out in the parking lot trying to sell you a tour package or whatever. And I was like, yeah, I'm just going to go up there and run around and stuff. And he was like, no, you can't do that. You're going to die. Like you can't possibly do that. What are you talking about? And I was like, I think it'll be okay. Like I've run at altitude a lot. I think it'll be fine. And it was fine. And, I, I think that is it's an archetypal story of my experience here, in that I think a lot of the time people have told me that what I want to do is stupid or not possible or not feasible, and then it goes, And so I think one of the things, and we've talked about it a lot in this block, is this idea of just experimenting on yourself. I think there's so many things in the preparation and training for how people climb these mountains that is conventional wisdom that doesn't really hold up. Uh, like it's not based on anything, I guess, other than this is how we've always done it. Sometimes there's a little bit of that. Sometimes there's some science or at least a lot of anecdotal stuff. But also, I just feel like I'm coming into it from a very different background than most people. I'm coming into it from a running background, from a track and field background, and then from an ultra running background. And so even something as simple as like nutrition on the mountain, that's something that I see people going up for a 12-hour day on an 8,000er and they have like a granola bar and a Sprite. I'm like, what? I'm like, I'm treating that like an ultra, like a 100-mile race. Like I'm taking 400 calories an hour. And I think that part of my success is not necessarily because I am talented or have any innate gifts. It's because I've just approached it differently, and I've trained for these events here in the mountains more like a trail race or an ultra marathon or even a track and field competition. So I think my time here, the thing that I've seen and is almost like, sometimes like what not to do when observing others, and also just like questioning. I think that's the big thing, is like looking at what other people are doing. And I think, the first time I was here, like my first 8,000 expedition, I just really listened to what other people, other guides and other climbers were doing, because it's like, okay, like these guys know what they're doing. I'm just going to follow them. And then looking at that afterwards and thinking, okay, why are we doing it that way? Why did I do this instead of that? Why are we climbing in the night instead of during the day? All kinds of things like that. And so I think that was a big thing for me, was just learning to both look at what is presented in terms of the conventional wisdom and taking it with a grain of salt and seeing if there's ways that we can tweak that. Yeah, I think that's been the big thing.
Once again, as our public service to the community, for listeners who might be inspired to visit the Himalaya themselves, what advice would you have for people planning their first trip to the region? Any specific do's or don'ts?
The Himalaya is a really big region with a lot of different things to do, different kinds of activities, for different levels of, ability and fitness. So the first thing that I would say to anyone who wants to come to Nepal, first of all, is you should come, because it is the most amazing place on earth. Like 100%, you should come. If you're thinking about it, make it happen. The people, the food, the mountains, everything about it is just incredible. I'm like literally looking out my window and there's like a crazy light on the giant mountain that's like right behind some fog and it's peeking out. It's outrageous. So number one is do it. Number two is think about, what do you want to do while you're here? What kind of trip do you want to have? Are you someone who is super fit and wants to do a bunch of climbing or trail running or something like that? Because that's going to look very different than someone who is, more sedentary and just wants to kind of, see the mountains and have a mountain experience. Um, because there's everything. You have easy hiking, you have really intense, big, long, multi-day hikes. You have really technical, hard climbing, and you have easy hiking kind of climbing. So you really have this huge, huge spectrum of options for what you can do. So the first thing I would think about is like, okay, what am I ready for and what is exciting to me? Like, don't bite off more than you can chew. Don't be like, oh, I'm going to climb Everest just because I hiked Mount Monadnock. Like, that's, I think, setting yourself up for maybe not having the best experience. I think I would think about what kind of, outdoorsy active trips have you really enjoyed? What were you doing on those trips? And then use that as a base point and then talk to someone who knows what they're talking about, whether that's, someone like Dallas Steven at Asian Trekking or, ChatGPT, literally, like anybody, but say, hey, like I had a really great time, doing this hike in the Grand Canyon in Arizona, and I want to go to the Himalaya. What would be kind of a comparable thing? The thing that I said before about the Himalaya is true, is that especially for North Americans and South Americans, really for almost anybody, it is a long trip to get here. So for my American visitors, if you have a 5-day vacation, you just can't come to Nepal. Like it takes 2 days just to get here. And you're going to spend your whole time just traveling. I think really you want to have like at least a week in country, which really means you need like at least 10 days, kind of door to door from North America, and honestly, probably from Europe as well. So it is remote. And I think that's one of the things that makes it really cool, because there's a lot of awesome stuff. And it like keeps it from becoming like totally overrun, though it definitely can be crowded. But yeah, I think give yourself enough time and figure out what is an appropriate kind of trip that makes sense for you. I think those would be the two really big things. And as always, feel free to like reach out to us in the comments. If you have questions, want to come to Nepal, I'm always happy to chat, provide advice, stuff like that. Because yeah, it's a really magical, special, wonderful place.
Thanks very much, and read us out.
All right, guys, I know this has been an odd episode. We are hoping that we can have our connectivity fixed for next week's, but we appreciate you bearing with us. And a huge shout out to our editors, Kat and Jason Anderson, who are the dream team. They do all our social media and all of our editing here at Talking with My Dad, and also all of my social media in general. They're fantastic. So thank you guys, and thank you for listening, watching, whatever. Please, as always, send us any feedback, questions, comments, concerns, hopes, dreams, the usual. You can send those to me by email, ty@chowsky.run, or DM me, Tyler C. Andrews, on Instagram. And remember, this is still a multimedia project. We've got the Substack, Tyler C. Andrews, where you can read my raw training logs, as well as this podcast, which goes up on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. This is a Chowsky Media production, and is brought to you by the good folks at Chowsky Endurance Collective, the world's leader in online coaching, travel, and community for endurance athletes. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you all next week. Ciao.